Today I'll be showing you how to edit this photo in 10 easy steps using GIMP, the free photo editor. I'll be using the brand new GIMP 3.0 that was just released not that long ago. Just a quick note, I do have this histogram dialog opened, and you can also open that by going to Windows, Dockable Dialogs, Histogram. Let's get started. I'll call this first step, step 0. I'm just going to open the photo into GIMP. So all I need to do is drag and drop the photo over here onto this little Wilbur icon and release. It may ask you if you want to convert or keep the color profile. Click keep for simplicity's sake. But once the photo is opened up here, you can center everything up by hitting Control-Shift-J or Command-Shift-J on your keyboard. So step 1 is we're going to increase the exposure of our photo. To do this, we'll come over here to the Colors menu, and this is where you're going to find most of your image adjustments. And then we can come over here to Exposure. And now you're going to see the exposure dialog, and your image is going to be located over here in what's called the Layers panel. And so here you'll see your image layer listed, and you'll see a little effects icon now appear while you're using this filter. More on this momentarily, but the exposure filter is going to allow you to adjust the exposure of your image. When you're taking a photo, the exposure is adjusted in camera via one of 3 ways, including your ISO, your aperture, or your shutter speed. And adjusting those 3 options is always the best way to adjust the exposure in your image. You also have a manual exposure inside your camera, which isn't really the recommended way to adjust exposure. But we've already taken the photo, so we have to brighten this thing up. And what we can do is we can increase the exposure here using this exposure slider. And you'll see if I hover my mouse over it, it says relative brightness change in stops. So we can increase or decrease the exposure using stops, and a stop is going to be a value of 1.0. So if I middle click on this number with my mouse and I type 1.0 and hit the enter key, that's the equivalent of increasing the brightness by 1 stop. And by the way, the term stop means you are doubling the amount of light, or if you're decreasing it, you're halving the amount of light. And one downside of increasing the exposure too much is that you're going to introduce a little too much noise to your photo. So even if your photo still looks dark after significantly increasing the exposure, I don't recommend fully compensating for that darkness using the exposure slider. You can see my histogram over here looks more even right now. However, just looking at the photo, you could tell it doesn't look right. There's way too much noise going on. Everything looks kind of whitewashed. I don't remember where I heard it, but I heard somewhere that you don't really want to go over 1 stop when you're artificially increasing the exposure. So what I'm going to do is go 0.5 and hit the enter key. So that's going to allow us to increase by half a stop. And then the black level slider here allows you to increase or decrease the black value of the pixels in your image. So if I slide this to the left, you're going to see that the color black is going to increase in brightness. It's going to brighten up the image overall. However, it's also going to flatten the image and just reduce the contrast a little bit. And if I go to the right, it's going to increase the amount of black pixels in the image, which is going to darken the image overall. And that, of course, just doesn't look very good to me. So in this case, I just went down by a value of 0.001. That's the equivalent of just clicking this little minus button here once. You can click the plus button once if you want to go back up. You can always use this preview button to see a before and after, or you can use the split view option. And if you click and drag this line, you could see the before is on the right, the after is on the left. And when you're happy with it, click OK, and that applies your filter. So the exciting part about GIMP 3.0 is that you now have non-destructive editing, which means that the filter you just applied is going to be over here inside the effects dialog. So when I click this effects icon, it gives me the effects dialog. And now you're going to see those exposure adjustments we just made to our image. You'll see this effect corresponds to this image layer. And if I wanted to make adjustments to this, I can simply double click on it and it's going to bring the exposure dialog back up. I'll just hit cancel. And I can show or hide the effects there, or I can get rid of the effects altogether by clicking this X icon. Step 2 is going to be adding the shadows and highlights adjustment to the image. And once again, we can do that by coming over here to Colors and come here to Shadows Highlights. This dialog also allows you to adjust the exposure in your image, but allows you to concentrate your adjustments to just the shadows or the highlights of your image. And it does some other things as well we're going to cover here. But you'll see that when I increase the value of shadows, it's going to brighten up or increase the exposure of the pixels there in the shadows of the image. And similarly, when you decrease the highlights, it's going to decrease the value of those highlight pixels. If you increase this value using the slider, it's going to increase those pixel values there in the highlights. In this photo in particular, there's not a ton going on in the highlights, so it's a little hard to tell what exactly is going on. Whenever I'm making these shadows, highlights adjustments, I typically like to stay within the 50 to 70 range. That's pretty normal. You can go outside of that, of course. You can definitely go less if you want, if you don't need to make as much exposure adjustments. Maybe you don't need to make any at all, which is great. So it's not an unbreakable rule. It's just something I like to generally stick with. So I'm just going to middle click on this value here and type 50 and hit the enter key. And also similarly, middle click here, and I'm just gonna manually type -60, hit the enter key. Again, we can do a before and after. Now you'll also see a couple of other sliders here, including shadows color adjustment and highlights color adjustment. This is going to adjust the saturation of the colors in this area of the photo. So if I decrease this value, it's going to decrease the saturation of the pixels in the shadows area of the image. So if you increase the brightness of your shadows and it just introduced too much color to your image, you can decrease those colors using this slider. In my particular case, I don't think it's an issue, so I'm going to keep it at 100. And then highlights, same thing. It starts at 50. You can decrease the saturation of those highlight pixels, or you can increase them if you feel that the color or the saturation of those pixels was affected by your highlights adjustment. But once again, I'll keep that value set to 50. The white point adjustment allows you to adjust the point at which pixels in your image are considered pure white pixels. And basically when you increase this value, it's going to brighten up the photo. So more bright pixels in the image will be considered pure white. On the other hand, if I decrease this value, you're going to have less of those white pixels. So this is just going to adjust that white point value in your photo. And then radius and compress have to do with controlling the effects here. And these sliders are pretty similar. If you hover your mouse, it says spatial extent. This is basically just controlling the spillover of those brighter pixels into neighboring pixels as far as I understand it. So if you decrease the radius value, it's just going to reduce that spillover, and you're going to see, in my opinion, a slightly less hazy image, almost like a more detailed image, because you don't have this dreamy fog sort of over your image from all the white pixels just spilling off all over the place. And then compress is very similar, except it's going to compress the effect on shadows and highlights and preserve the midtones, as you can see there when I hover over it. So this does compress that effect to just the shadows and highlights and tries to reduce the spillover to the midtones. So I'm pretty happy with these values right here. Once again, you can perform the split view preview to see a before and after. And once you're ready, you can click OK. And now that effect has been assigned to the image layer here. And once again, it is inside the layer effects panel. I do recommend saving as you go. And you can do that by going to File, Save or Save As. And I'm just going to name this Edit 3. XCF is going to be the native file format for GIMP, and I'll click Save. And then you can just hit Control or Command S as you go to continue saving your work. Next up, we're going to perform a levels adjustment. So we're going to go to Colors, Levels. And you can really use levels or curves for these adjustments. I'm going to go with levels because I want to keep this more of a beginner's tutorial, and levels is a bit more beginner friendly. But basically you have a channel drop down right here, and by default it's set to value, which is going to be your red, green, and blue color channels all merged into one. And then you have your individual color channels here, red, green, and blue. And value is really, once again, going to adjust like the brightness of the image, especially across the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So you're going to see your histogram for your image displayed right here inside of what's called input levels. Down here, you're going to have a little triangle. That's going to be the slider for the shadows. Right here is another triangle for your midtones. And right here, you'll see a triangle for the highlights. And you'll see this little bar running across here. It goes from black to indicate shadows to middle gray for midtones and then white for the highlights. So what you can do is click and drag one of these little triangles and just drag it inwards in this case. And you'll see as we do that, it's going to make the image a little darker because it's basically shifting the values of the shadows in our image so that anything to the left of this point right here is considered black now, sort of like shifting the black level. And then everything to the right of this value is just going to be brighter and brighter. And so this value here allows you to shift the midtones, and you'll see that's going to brighten up the image here because all of our midtones are becoming brighter when I shift this to the left. When I shift it to the right, the midtones become darker. So in this case, I'm just going to very minimally increase the value of the midtones since we've already done a lot of adjustments using exposure and shadows highlights. And finally, this far right slider here is for adjusting the highlights. And you'll see that as I drag this in, the image is going to get brighter overall because we're changing which pixel values will be pure white. I'm not going to overdo it. I'll set that to 214. And here's a before, here is an after. So that is the value channel. Now let's come over to red, green, and blue. So we'll start off here on the red channel, and the principles are going to be the same, except instead of adjusting the brightness of the image, we're now either going to be introducing more red or cyan. So if we click and drag the shadow slider, you're going to see that's going to introduce cyan to the shadows. And I'm just going to introduce a little bit there. Here we have the midtone slider. So if I click and drag this, you'll see it's either going to add red to the midtones, or if I go the opposite direction, it'll add cyan. And finally, on the far right, we have the highlight slider. And if I drag this inwards, it's going to introduce red to the highlights. And if I drag it back, it's just going to reintroduce the original cyan to those highlights. So I'll place it about right there, and that looks pretty good. One last thing I'll point out here before we move on is that you'll see the bar right here change colors a little bit. So this is just indicating what color is being introduced to the image. So you'll see right here, it's just a slight tint of red now being introduced to the highlights there. Let's move on to the green channel. So the principles are the same for this one, except you're either adding green or you're adding magenta. Again, keep your eye on this color here, the color bar. So for example, if I just slide this way over, you'll see this bar will turn magenta, indicating that we're adding a bunch of magenta here, in this case, to the shadows. And if I go the other way with it, you'll see the bar will turn green because we're adding a bunch of green. So let's just do a little bit more of a minute adjustment. So just adding a little bit of magenta there to the shadows. This time let's start with the highlights, or go to the highlights next, I should say. So we're just going to add a little bit of green here to the highlights of the image. And then you can either add green to the midtones or add magenta to the midtones, depending on whether you go above the 1.0 value or below the 1.0 value. In this case, I'm just going to add a dash of magenta. All right, let's move on to the last color channel, which is the blue channel. In this case, you're either adding blue or you're adding yellow. So if we drag the shadow slider, you'll see that's going to add yellow to the shadows of the image. Let's come over here to the highlights, and we're just going to drag this down. You'll see that's going to add blue. And for the midtones here, if you go above 1.0, it's going to add blue. If you go below 1.0, it'll add yellow. And in this case, I want to really just bring out the golden hour, which is when I took this photo. So bring out the colors from the golden hour. So I'm going to add quite a bit of yellow here to the midtones. GIMP does have some built-in controls here for auto levels. That doesn't really work well in my opinion, in my usage. And also you'll see over here, you can select the shadows, midtones, or highlights in your image. This also hasn't really worked that well historically speaking, but feel free to give that a try if you want. But once you're ready, click OK, and that will apply the levels to our image. Step 4 is that we're going to adjust the color temperature of the image. So once again, we'll go to colors, and right here, you'll see it says color temperature. So this allows you to warm or cool the image. So you can set the original temperature of your image if you remember what the temperature was in your camera when you took the photo. Otherwise, it's not really necessary. You can really just increase this intended temperature slider. Increasing this value is going to warm the photo up. Decreasing it is going to cool the photo down. And you can also just middle click on this with your mouse and type a value. So I like to go with a nice even value. We'll go 7,000. That'll warm that photo up a little bit, and I'll click OK, and now we've improved the color temperature of the image. Step 5 is saturation. So once again, we'll go to colors, saturation, and this is going to enhance the intensity or the vibrancy, sometimes it's called, of the colors in the image. And you just have a simple slider here called scale. This just increases or decreases the strengthening of the saturation. So you can see increasing the scale just really saturates the photo. If I decrease the scale, it'll desaturate it. And if you desaturate it all the way, it becomes a black and white photo. And of course, you can middle click your mouse on here, and we can use the arrow to go to the far right and hit the backspace key to get rid of those numbers. And manually type a value there if you want, hit the enter key. So there you'll see I've added just a little bit of saturation, and I'll click OK. Step 6 will be a curves adjustment, so I'll go to Colors, Curves. This is very similar, like I said, to the Levels tool, except instead of just using 3 sliders, you have a curve. And so if I click and drag the curve upwards, it's going to increase the brightness, in this case, right here in the highlights, or I can decrease the brightness there in the highlights. And the cool thing about the curves, the reason it's so versatile, is you can release the mouse and create another point along the curve. So towards the center of the curve, this is the midtones. So I can decrease the midtone brightness or increase it. And if I come over here to the bottom left, this is going to be the shadows. So I can increase the value of the shadows there or decrease. And because it's a curve, you're basically getting this easing into the next adjustment. So we decreased the value there, the brightness of the shadows, and then it's just going to ease into whatever adjustment we made here with the midtones. Maybe we increase it, and then it's going to ease into the next adjustment there, the highlights adjustment. And so you get this sort of nice smooth transition. The downside of this is that because it's a curve, wherever the different pixels are in the image along the points of this curve are going to be affected based on the position of the curve here. So the pixels that are right here in the histogram, you can see that these pixel values will now drop and become darker. You can, of course, fix that just by creating a new point and then making another adjustment. But as you see, as you add more points, it gets a little complicated and things can start to look a little bit off. I do highly recommend this, but for beginners, just stick with the Levels tool. I'm going to click Reset. So it does work on the value channel as well as the individual color channels, which means you can introduce red or cyan and so on, as we talked about with the Levels tool. But for this particular tutorial, what I'm going to use this for is adding contrast to the image. So to add contrast using the Curves tool, all you have to do is click and drag in the highlights and just drag this up a little bit and release your mouse. And then click and drag over here in the shadows and drag the shadows downwards. And that's going to create what's called an S-curve. So whenever you have the highlights doing one thing and the shadows doing the opposite, that creates an S-curve. If this were low like this and this were high, that's an inverted S-curve. So let me just hit reset and just get this back close to where it was before. And once you're ready, click OK. Next up, we're going to add sharpening, and the best way to do this is using the popular Sharpen Unsharp Mask filter. So to access this, we're going to this time go to Filters, Enhance, Sharpen Unsharp Mask. It is just called Sharpen. It used to be called Unsharp Mask. They've just continued to call it Sharpen Unsharp Mask. And before I explain these sliders, it helps to understand that the way this filter works is by enhancing the edge details in the image. So anywhere where you see an edge, like where the ears meet the grass here, or where the eyeball meets the fur, those are going to be edges. The Sharpen filter is going to enhance the edge details to try to make the photo look sharper. So with that understanding, we have 3 sliders here. The radius slider, it says expressed as standard deviation in pixels. That just determines how many pixels on either side of an edge detail are going to be affected. So basically increasing the radius is going to spread this effect out to more pixels, and you'll see the effect there. You kind of start to get this black outline around everything, or almost like a shadow. And what value you want this set to is going to depend on the size of your photo. So this photo is over 5,000 by over 3,400 pixels. So smaller and larger photos are going to have different radius settings that work for them. I'm going to set this to 3, hit the Enter key, and then amount is just going to be the strength of the sharpening. So drag this to the right, it increases the sharpening. Drag it to the left, decreases the sharpening. More sharpening typically introduces noise, so you don't want to overdo it. And not enough sharpening, of course, just makes the photo look a little bit blurry. So in this case, I'm just going to type 1.0 and hit the Enter key. You also have the threshold slider, which kind of determines which pixels throughout the image are going to be affected by sharpening. I don't usually use this slider, so I'm just going to decrease this, and I'll click OK. Step 8 for editing an image in GIMP is to add a vignette. And vignettes are great because they just focus the attention of the viewer on the subject in the photo. It also helps to sort of darken the edges of the photo. You can add a vignette by going to Filters, Light and Shadow, Vignette. And GIMP has had this really nice on-canvas editor for the vignette for quite some time now. It's also non-destructive, meaning you can go back later and make edits to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click and drag the center of the vignette here, or the center X and Y, and that is just going to hover this over the center of the subject, which is the bunny. And then I can hover my mouse over the outer ring of this vignette and click and drag. And that's just going to change the radius of this, and you'll see also the softness slider here is being affected. So basically it's just determining the point at which the darkest point of the vignette starts fading out. And then we can drag this dotted inner ellipse here, and you're going to see that's going to change the gamma. So that's just kind of determining the fall off rate of this vignette as it transitions from this darker color into showing our subject there in the middle. And you can also expand the size of the middle here if you want the subject to be a little bit larger. And once you're happy, come over here, click OK. So coming back over here to the effects panel, you can see all the effects we've added to this point. You can go in here at any time and just double click on any of these and it will reopen those up. So for example, let's adjust the sharpening by double clicking, and there you'll see the sharpen dialog. Click OK, and the filter would now be updated. Step 9 is to add some denoise to the photo. So through our edits, we did introduce a little bit of noise here. And actually, this probably should have been step 8 because the vignette's covering it up a little bit. But what I can do is click on effects and just hide the vignette temporarily. And so now we're going to reduce the noise by going to Filters, Enhance, Noise Reduction. And I'm just stayed here on this part of the image because this is where I see a lot of noise right here. So this is pretty simple. You just have a slider and it's called strength, and you can either reduce the strength, which is just going to bring back the noise, or you can increase the strength, and that is going to reduce the noise. So I'm going to go with 5. I think that's a pretty good balance between not introducing too much blur, which is what happens when you add more noise reduction, and not keeping too much of the original noise in the photo, and come over here and click OK. So we can come back to the effects, and we can unhide the vignette. And if you want the vignette to be above noise reduction, simply come over here and just click this down arrow, and noise reduction will be placed below vignette. So again, hit Control S to save your work, and I'll hit Control Shift J to center things up. So the last step, step 10, is going to be to crop and export the photo. So to crop in GIMP, you can hit Shift C on the keyboard or grab the crop tool from the toolbox. You can fix your aspect ratio by checking this box here if you have a particular aspect ratio you want to use. For example, if you type 1920:1080, it's going to lock the aspect ratio of your crop. And I can now click and drag my mouse, and you'll see the crop area drawing there. If you want to go outside of the layer boundary here, the image boundary, you can click this Allow Growing option. Otherwise, when that's unchecked, this is going to stop right at the boundary. And by the way, this area here is called the Tool Options dialog. If you don't see it, go to Windows, Dockable Dialogs, Tool Options. But you can adjust the crop here. And if you want to change the lines or the guides inside the crop area, you can click this drop down and you can have no guides, you can have center lines, you can have rule of thirds, fifths, golden sections, or diagonal lines. Let's go rule of thirds. And once you're happy with the crop area, just click inside the crop area and that'll crop the image. You may want to adjust the vignette after you've applied the crop if you don't like the way it looks anymore. So of course you can always just double click the filter, make your adjustments there, and click OK. So now to export this image, just go to File, Export, or Export As, and you can name your photo, so Cute Bunny. And then you can end this with whatever file name you want to use or whatever file type you want to use. So this right now is set to a PNG file type. If you want to select a new file type, you can come down here and you have tons of different file types to choose from. You can also simply type the file extension you want to use right here. So for example, .jpg would save that as a JPEG. You can select the location on your computer using the folders here to navigate. And once you're ready, click export. In this case, we're exporting to a JPEG, so it's going to bring up the JPEG dialog. So here we can adjust some settings to our JPEG, for example, the quality of the JPEG. If we had a CMYK color profile attached to this photo, I could export it as a CMYK photo. I do not have a color profile assigned to this though, so I can't do that right now. But really for JPEGs, all you need is to adjust the quality. I like to go with something like 85, especially if I'm using this on the web. Once you're ready, come over here and click export again. I'll show you one last before and after. I'll click the effects icon. There's a before. And there's an after. And that's how you edit a photo in GIMP 3.0 in 10 simple steps. Hopefully you liked this tutorial. If you did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and click the bell icon to be notified each time I have a brand new tutorial. You can check out any of the links to my resources in the description of the video. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.